Well, good morning, brothers and sisters and young people, guests and friends. It is indeed a great honor and pleasure to come before you this morning. What a great opportunity to learn from God's Word as we begin this gathering with the study on Esther. My part will involve Esther chapter 1 and chapter 2 to verse 18, which is the natural break within the storyline. So let's begin. It's party time in the Persian Empire, and King Ahasuerus has now been throwing parties for several months, showing off his worldly goods and treasures, making sure the diplomats and dignitaries are being well looked after, that their cups never empty, nor their bellies. But this party business comes at a great cost. Wine and the finest foods in the area are not cheap at all, and soon the treasury of his kingdom will be running dry. So the king needs allies, partners in war. Hence the parties to entice his surrounding officials so he can make war against the Greeks and the Turks to refill his coffers with more of these. Sister Anita, if I could get you to pass around that. This coin which I'm passing around is from King Croesus, the last king of Lydia, or modern-day Turkey. This third stater coin was minted around 610 to 545 BC. And it's because of the wealth that Turkey and Greece had, this is why our King Ahasuerus needed more, and he needed these more than anything right now. But enough about politics. Let's get back to the party. Let me read you Esther 1, 4 through 5. When he showed his riches and his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. But by showing off all these treasures of his kingdom, his riches, his objects, he still thought that he had one last surprise up his sleeve, or so he thought. But this, my brothers and sisters, brings us to Queen Vashti. And this was King Ahasuerus' ace card. The beautiful Queen Vashti. Even her name, Vashti, means goodness or best or excellent. But let me set a scene for you if I can. In the palace of King Ahasuerus, we have a collection of drunken kings and diplomats, dignitaries, generals. They have spent the last few months being totally amazed at the king's treasures. And now, as the partying winds down to a close, it's time for the king to bring out his amazingly beautiful wife. But what the king does not realize is that it will be not what he expected. Let us read Esther 1, 11 through 12 again. To bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Oh boy, so here we have it. Number one, we have a queen that has just disobeyed her king and husband. And two, we have a king that has disrespected his queen and his wife. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. I am so glad that we have this record in history, so we can look back in time and see that men have been constantly putting themselves into this type of situation. That's why I can show my sister wife Sherry it's a genetic thing. Men have always been putting their foot in their mouths. But seriously, what was God's plan in all of this? We can all plainly see that what the king asked for was totally disrespectful and embarrassing to Queen Vashti. But let me say that what Queen Vashti did was wrong also. She did not submit to her husband and her king. She decided to stand up against him and deny his request. But the book of Esther is not about how God was able to... But the book of Esther is about how God was able to make these two wrongs and move in the life of Esther in a way that would save the Jewish people. God was able to take these wrongs and make a tremendous right out of it. Did you know that not at one time does the name of God appear in the book of Esther? But the providence of God is abundant throughout it. The book of Esther is addressed to the multitudes of Jews who did not return to Judea, but remained in voluntary exile. And so here we have King Ahasuerus continuing to make bad decisions. It was foolish of him to have Queen Vashti disposed and exiled in his anger. People have often made foolish choices and adversely affected all of their lives in one way or another. Or we face setbacks, defeats, or discouragements because of poor decisions that we or someone else made in the moment of anger, depression, or fear. Doing brain-dead stuff when we're angry is like buying stuff on a credit card and not paying it off before the interest accrues. That is why the world takes Visa. Buy now, pay later, pay with interest. Let me repeat that. Doing brain-dead stuff when we're angry is like buying stuff with a credit card and not paying it off before the interest accrues. That is why the world takes Visa. Buy now, pay later, pay with interest. So what are some of the wrong things that we do when we're angry? I was told I only had about 15 or 20 minutes, but now I have enough ideas for my exhorts for the next year. But the first one I came up with it is a mistake to invest in pride. King Ahasuerus' misguided decision to get rid of Vashti stemmed from egotism. He made a foolish request of his wife, an unmanly, unkind, and disrespectful request to her to appear before the drunken mob as one of his objects or possessions. Pride often imitates, inflames, and intensifies anger. That's why it's a big mistake to invest into pride. You see, whenever we invest in whatever we invest in, we become committed to. Once the king had invested so deeply in pride, he committed himself to self-glorification and self-honor. He became so self-focused that he had no clue as to what his request would mean to his wife. We all have these momentary lapses of judgment when we think too highly of ourselves. The key is not to let this false impression of ourselves last. Don't invest in them. When we feel foolish pride swelling up inside us, we need to follow that old saying and swallow our pride. The second mistake I came up with, it's a mistake to borrow bitterness. So what's the first thing that King Ahasuerus does when Queen Vashti turned down his insulting idea? Let me read you Esther 1:13. Then the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew the law and judgment. So what's wrong with this picture? Isn't it smart to get ideas from other people when you are confronted by a tough situation? Generally speaking, it is wise to lean on a wider body of ideas that comes with your own life experiences. But think about it. Was he really asking the right people? Do you know that what the king was doing? He was doing the same thing we've all done before. He asked these guys because he knew they would tell him what he wanted to hear. The purpose of his 6-month and 1-week-long party was to show everybody how important he was. His crowning moment was to be the cameo appearance of his beautiful wife. He was going to parade her into the arena of inebriated inhabitants of the capital city, and she refused him. It is never proper to make requests of others to humiliate or in any way exploit them in any form. But back to the point about being a mistake to borrow bitterness. Reading the reply from the king's cabinet to his plea for advice, you get the idea that these guys were insecure, to say the least, and maybe a little bitter to boot. But let me read you Esther 16 through 22. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to the princes, and to all the people that are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husband in their eyes, when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. And when the king's decree, which shall be published throughout all his empire, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both in great and small. And this saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters to all the king's provinces, and to every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, and every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Anger is like a splinter in your finger. If you leave it there, it gets infected and hurts every time you use that finger. But if you remove it, that sore heals and you eventually feel better. Don't borrow bitterness. Don't let someone else's anger invade your life. It kills relationships everywhere. Later in the book of Esther, we see signs that King Ahasuerus was regretting his hasty decision, for it was very foolish. It's just one of those foolish things we do when we're angry, when we're depressed and frustrated. It's why the world loves to take Visa. It knows that our immediate gratification is not as profitable for us as waiting on God. So what mistakes do we need to avoid when the pressure is on? 1, it's a mistake to invest in pride. And 2, it's a mistake to borrow bitterness. So that brings us to Esther chapter 2. In the first 18 verses, we see that Esther is selected as one of the king's concubines and undergoes a vigorous ritual to prepare her for the meeting of the king. God allows her to find favor with everyone she comes in contact with. So now the party is over and the lights are all out, and we begin in Esther 2, 1-4. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what he was decreed against her. Then said the king's servant that ministered unto him, Let there be fair young virgins sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Heg, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Notice how the passage starts off, after these things. And from Esther 2:16 we find out that it's roughly around a 3-year period from the events of chapter 1. So the extravagant party banquet of chapter 1 is well in the past, and the king is feeling a little sad. You see, things aren't going well for King Ahasuerus. History records it for us that the king recently returned from a failed military mission from Greece. On top of that, he misses Queen Vashti. Nothing is going well, and nothing can cheer him up. There's no joy at home, and he can't even get pleasure from beating up the Greeks. So what can we do for such a man? Clearly, there is nothing to do for that man in this type of state. Well, apparently almost nothing. The wise men of Persia have one little suggestion. How about a Miss Persia contest? They ask with smiles on their faces. There is, of course, a twist. The winner of the contest becomes the new queen. To this once sad king agrees, and the contest begins. Let me read you Ephesians 5:25-31. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of the water by the word, that the might present to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever hath hated his own flesh, but nourish and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. So we must take courage to remain true to our walk in the truth, and not be led astray by the ever-increasing deception that is in our world. Beware of the enemy's craftiness. To this end, just as King Ahasuerus gave Esther gifts to enable her and aid her in her preparation, so the King of Kings has given us what we need for our preparation and our sanctification. The comparisons and contrasts with the Christadelphian life are clear. We are currently in a time of preparation for our King. This period just doesn't last 1 year. It takes a lifetime. In the book of Esther, we learn how Hadassah, probably said that wrong, Esther's Hebrew name, which means myrtle, underwent almost a year of beauty treatments with spices and cosmetics to make her desirable for the king. Esther was prepared with the help of the eunuch that provided her with all of the oil of myrrh and spices. In the way Esther was prepared, the Spirit provides us, his betrothed, with oil of myrrh, which allows us to share in his sufferings. Let me read you Philippians 3:10-11. That I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death, if by any means I might obtain unto the resurrection of the dead. These spices are emitted in our lives when we clothe ourselves with righteous acts and deeds as the brides of Christ and spend that quality time with him. Just like when a spouse or a good friend greets you with a hug and is wearing a cologne or perfume, that fragrance lingers with you after they are gone. So it is with Jesus. People will begin to recognize there is something different about you when you have been in his presence. We are all to be the fragrance of Christ to our Heavenly Father, as mentioned in the Old Testament, and again in 2 Corinthians 2:15, where it says, For we are unto God a sweet Savior of Christ, in them that are saved and in them that perish. Our preparation is not only through the oil and the myrrh and the spices, but through the training of the Word and our diligent walk in the truth. It's no accident that the king made a dumb decision he made. It's no coincidence that Queen Vashti took a stand that she did. It's no happenstance that Mordecai was there to eavesdrop on the assassination attempt when he was. And it's not luck that Esther became queen when she did. God placed Esther in the right place at the right time to carry out his will and his plan for the salvation of his people. Mordecai knew that, and Esther began to learn it. The same holds true for us. God has us in the right place at the right time to serve him and bring about the fulfillment of his will. It's not coincidence that you work where you do. It's not fate that you live in the neighborhood you live in. Your life, your relationships, your job, your friends, your everything is not just luck. So remember, that is why the world takes Visa. Buy now, pay later, pay with interest. But let me close with a reading for you from Isaiah 43:1. But now thus saith the Lord that created thee, O Jacob, that he that formed thee, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name, thou art mine.